In 1954, the United States overthrew a democracy, not to protect freedom, not to stop communism, but to protect bananas. This is the story of how the CIA toppled Guatemala's elected government, crushed land reform, and handed the country to dictators, all so that an American fruit company could keep its empire. Jacobo Árbenz was elected president of Guatemala in 1950. He wasn't a radical, and he wasn't a communist. He was a nationalist, determined to lift his people out of poverty. At the time, most Guatemalans were poor farmers. Just 2% of landowners controlled over 70% of the farmland. Vast swathes of fertile land sat idle, owned by the United Fruit Company, an American corporation with enormous influence in Guatemala and across Central America. United Fruit, today known as Chiquita, was more than just a company. It was an empire. It controlled railroads, ports, communications, and politics. Guatemalans had a nickname for their country. Not a republic, but a banana republic, a nation where democracy was a facade and real power belonged to foreign corporations. Árbenz wanted to change that. His plan was simple: agrarian reform. Unused land, owned by big landowners like United Fruit, would be purchased by the government and redistributed to poor farmers who actually worked the soil. The government offered compensation based on the land's declared tax value. But here was the problem. To avoid taxes, United Fruit had been massively undervaluing its land for years. When Árbenz offered compensation at that tax rate, United Fruit screamed theft. But instead of negotiating, the company went to Washington, and Washington listened. United Fruit had powerful friends. Its PR team launched a campaign, painting Árbenz as a dangerous communist. It hired advertising firms, lobbied Congress, and planted stories in American newspapers. It didn't matter that Árbenz was not a communist. What mattered was that he threatened corporate profits. And in the 1950s, accusing someone of communism was enough to justify almost anything. The Eisenhower administration was full of men tied to United Fruit. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had worked for the law fruit his brother United Fruit. His brother Alan Dulles was director of the CIA and also sat on United Fruit's. The CIA launched Operation PBSUCCESS. The plan was classic Cold War regime change, disinformation, psychological warfare, and a small army of exiles backed with American money and weapons. CIA radio stations spread propaganda, claiming Árbenz was arming peasants for a communist revolution. Pamphlets warned of Soviet domination. Fake news stories in Guatemalan and US newspapers painted the president as a dictator in waiting. On the ground, the CIA recruited Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, a right-wing exile, to lead a small force of just a few hundred men. On paper, it looked ridiculous. How could a few hundred rebels overthrow a government with thousands of soldiers? But the coup wasn't about battlefield strength, it was about perception. CIA pilots bombed Guatemala City, dropping leaflets and a few explosives. CIA radio broadcasts announced massive rebel victories that never actually happened. Nervous Guatemalan officers, unsure who was winning, began to doubt their government. Washington amped up the pressure. US warships moved into the Caribbean, and the threat of full American invasion loomed. Árbenz, isolated and abandoned, realized the truth. His army would not fight for him. On June 27, 1954, he resigned, handing power to the military. Soon after, Castillo Armas took control, backed by the CIA and United Fruit. The land reform was reversed. United Fruit got its plantations back. For Guatemala, the price was catastrophic. The coup marked the beginning of decades of dictatorship, repression, and civil war. Castillo Armas purged suspected leftists, burned books, and outlawed unions and political parties. Over the next 40 years, successive US-backed regimes waged a brutal campaign against dissent, culminating in the slaughter of indigenous Mayan communities during the Guatemalan Civil War. By the time the conflict ended in the 1990s, more than 200,000 people were dead. And what had been the great threat? Land reform. A democratic government trying to give farmers a chance at survival. That was the communism that had to be crushed. The story of Guatemala's coup is often forgotten in the shadow of Iran or Chile, but it set the template for US intervention in Latin America. Democracy was tolerated only if it served American business interests. If it didn't, then democracy could be overthrown. For United Fruit, the coup was a victory. For Washington, it was a win in the Cold War. But for Guatemalans, it was the beginning of a nightmare, one that would last generations. Today, Guatemala still struggles with poverty, inequality, and violence. The wounds of 1954 never fully healed, and the term Banana Republic, born out of United Fruit's domination of Central America, still haunts the way we talk about countries forced into dependency by foreign powers. The 1954 coup wasn't about freedom, and it wasn't about about communism, it was about bananas, it was about profit, and like so many colonial crimes dressed up as Cold War necessity, it was ordinary people who paid the price. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more deep dives into the world's incredible histories.